Are early access games really a scam? I don't know, but by the time we reach the end of this video, we might have a better idea. So stick around if you're interested in chatting about it with me. Now, I know some of you might love the idea of supporting a game before it's even finished, and trust me, if the game catches my eye, so do I. But it is undeniable that early access is changing and has been for quite some time. Unfortunately though, it's not always for the better. Early access as a whole has strayed far from what it set out to be in the first place. But what did early access actually start off as, and when? Unofficially, first signs of early access can probably be rooted back to the modern community, in certain games on a smaller, more private scale. But many consider the first instance of early access to be with Minecraft. What we now know is the incredibly popular survival sandbox game started development in 2009 and was intended for web browsers. How things have changed. Minecraft went through a pre-alpha stage in its very early doors before proving its worth and giving its developer, Marcus Persson, a good enough reason to charge users $10 to be able to access the game to further support and experience its development. Later down the line, the support of the game allowed him to quit his job to work on Minecraft full-time, and eventually founding Mojang to bring in a full development team to turn Minecraft into what it is today. The endlessly popular and recognizable trophy game. How wholesome, if only every story could have the same foundations. Now, does anyone know of the digital distribution service for video games called Desura? I think that's how you say it. Well, if you answered no, then neither did I before researching this video. So don't worry, and maybe that's a faux pas on my behalf, but anyway, Desura was somewhat like Steam, but it released way later. Steam was released in 2003, whereas Desura released in 2011, and I suppose the big difference between the two was that Desura was a service primarily focused on indie games and indie developers. So much so that they were seemingly the first to release an early access-like program, which they named Alpha Funding in 2011. And a game still popular now called Project Zomboid was one of the first 5 games to be released through this program. Unfortunately, in 2014, Desura was sold to a company called Bad Juju Games, but they later filed for bankruptcy in June 2015 after facing backlash for failing to pay developers on the platform their fair share of game sales. And now a decade later, and after being offline at one point for 4 years, Desura has become a website that hosts a catalogue of web browser games. During the time that Desura was being brought to life and consequentially dying, Steam, the other distribution service probably recognised by many more, was busy releasing their very own early access program in 2013, simply called Steam Early Access, allowing developers to sell their games while those games were still being developed and worked on. And this program still exists to this day, and you can find it on the front page of Steam. If you're a developer looking to put your game into early access on Steam, they have a handy yet basic list of rules that you have to abide by that include things such as be clear about the state of your game, don't make promises that you can't keep, don't overcharge, and don't launch without a playable game. So we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here. But if you look at the page yourself, you'll notice that Steam really do provide some helpful toolkits and precursors in managing the expectations of your potential audience, advocating for an honest and transparent experience with the players in the early access development stages. For reference, some of Steam's first ever early access games include Arma 3, Kerbal Space Program, Prison Architect, all of which went on to receive very positive reviews. A Reddit user went on to post some other games that were involved in early access at this time, and although the sample size was fairly small, someone in the comments luckily did the math, so I don't have to. And the outcome was as follows. Successful games were 52.5%, and failure games were 47.5%. So just 2 less games were rated poorly or not continued than the ones that were rated highly and still somewhat successful to this day. And I suppose the only conclusion that we can pull from this is that not all games that enter early access will have a positive outcome, even with funding from the players and feedback in development. But those are the risks that you sometimes take. Even after the game is fully developed, I'm sure we've all spent money on a fully released version 1.0 of a game that we ended up not enjoying as much as we thought we would. I can count so many, but then again, I tend to purchase on a whim without much research. And I've kind of learned my lesson. This can also be applied to things like movies though. You're paying for a cinema ticket without the assurance that you'll enjoy the movie, right? But I guess you don't see many early access movies released in the cinema midway through the production with the crew still filming. That would be kind of odd. This isn't me saying that early access is all bad. There are many reasons that video games fail, despite their communal support, such as lack of direction, development taking too long, unrealistic promises, technical and performance issues, developer burnout, teams falling apart. And is it fair fair to say that developers shouldn't put games into early access and allow players to pay for them with the chance any of the aforementioned could be the final outcome? Probably not. Sometimes life happens. It happens. Not everything can be linear and go according to plan. And it doesn't mean they weren't once passionate about the project and envisioned it coming to life. But it's not necessarily with these teams that the issue lies. I think it's with the ones who release unfinished games, knowing that any of these problems will likely be the outcome. Some developers are using early access as a way to make quick cash off the consumer, and it is getting out of hand. Now, to some, this may be blindingly obvious, but to others who have only dipped their toe into the gaming industry, it may be unheard of. So let's take a further dive into the dark side of early access and how developers can be exploiting players, sometimes without even realizing it. When early access first became a thing, it seemed like an amazing idea. In theory, you get to play a game that is still in development, give feedback, and in return, you're helping the developers make their best version of a game. Seems like a win, right? Especially for incredibly impatient people like me. And I think I'm part of the problem. And honestly, some games have taken their shot at early access release and just done it correctly. Just look at Hades, whose developers rolled out actual valuable updates and content over a 2-year period. The content was there and regularly updated, and people were happy. And Subnautica, for another example, an incredible game that I wish I could play if I weren't terrified of the deep ocean and everything inside of it. But that game was in early access for just over 3 years, and although again, it probably feels like a lengthy period of time, many hardcore Subnautica fans do not regret their decision at picking up the game in early access. However, many warn that with the knowledge they have now, grabbing Subnautica 2 in its early access stage may lessen the feeling of the mystery and charm and diminish the enjoyment of a full playthrough of version 1.0 when it finally releases. And this may not be for another 2 to 3 more years. Point being, both of these games seem to have taken player feedback, refined their ideas, and really gave players a good experience in the end. But the sad thing we're coming to know is not all developers are in it for the long haul. Some are just here to make money, throw together something barely playable, and then leave it in a state of limbo for months or even years. And we, the players, are left holding the bag. And to reiterate my previous point, I know many developers don't have ill intent. Sometimes things just fail. Let's take a look at Multiversus, a fighting game developed by Player First Games that released into beta a few years back with reported bugs, dodgy hitboxes, major server errors, and an absolute grind to unlock new characters, and not enough updates to keep fans satisfied. And Multiversus was free, right? So what's the harm? Except while the game was still unfinished, Multiversus allowed players to buy a Founders Pack costing $100, and battle passes and fighters with some distinct advantages. This of course didn't go down too well with the gaming community, especially since Multiversus have announced mere days ago that Season 5 will be the final one and they are closing their servers. I guess all those people that purchase Founders Packs would very much struggle to get their money back. And this is just one of many similar examples. I suppose we should talk about microtransactions since we briefly touched upon it already. Don't get me wrong, I am not against microtransactions, unless there is some sneaky pay-to-win elements, in which case my opinion might change slightly. But if the base game is free, and I have or see myself spending hundreds of hours in said game, I am partial to buying a cosmetic skin. It's kind of my way of justifying it to myself. This isn't to say microtransactions are inherently a good thing, though. In fact, the complexity of the microtransaction argument goes deep, and I may make an entire other video on it, but for now we're only talking about games that go into early access with an uncertain future but still allow players to spend even more money in the game's unfinished state before knowing if the game will survive to a full release. In theory though, this is ultimately up to the consumer, right? No one is forcing you to buy an early access game, and no one is forcing you to spend your money on it either. It's just somewhat comedic when some games release with a shiny, polished shop to spend your real cash, while the rest of the game, the part that should really matter, is kind of lackluster and suffering. I understand developers working on projects they're passionate about need to secure funding and need a player base to believe in their projects. I think it's just far easier to lose a free-to-play audience when the benefits you get from paying for items and bonuses in-game make playing without spending your cash feel like a chore. and this is further amplified when the game you're grinding out isn't even the final version. Early access should be about progress, or if you're someone like me who is just a little impatient and doesn't care if something is buggy, the idea is that you're buying into a game with the understanding that it is not done yet. The deal is you get to help shape the game's development while enjoying some of the experience along the way, as many developers have done successfully. But for a lot of these titles, the reality is a lot more grim, and the consumer is left feeling like they were taken advantage of. Not every case is that gloomy. Some early access titles can kind of sit on the fence between good and bad. Take Project Zomboid or 7 Days to Die, for example. This game was literally in early access for like 10 years. I mean, congrats to 7 Days to Die though for having a consistent player base for that long, and it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. But it's kind of funny that some players believe the game only stepped out of its early access title to justify hiking up the price of the game. I don't know if this is pessimistic, but I can see why some people feel like they might have been playing the final version of the game for a while now. I would always argue that the worth of a game's price tag depends on how many hours you sink into it, and for quite a few of 7 Days to Die's player base, that is a lot of hours. Even though I am not a 7 Days to Die player myself, I really hope the game continues to release some of those really essential updates now that the game is no longer in early access, and the hardcore fans don't have to wait another 10 years for the game to painfully crawl towards something that's really final. I think it's also important to note in everything I've been talking about that there are different types of games, such as live service games, which are the ones that prompt the user to log in every day as not to miss things such as events, in-game items, collections, and rewards. And they often give the user the option to use microtransactions. A lot of these games run on servers, which means eventually if the game becomes unprofitable, they'll close down and anything you've spent money on will be gone. There is also a big worry about the fact that live service games have just become a way to shell out really bad excuses for AAA titles and take people's money. On the other hand, single-player games, offline games can drop off significantly between major updates, but have a large part of their community return when there is new content to explore in-game. And this doesn't mean that that game has failed. While the majority of this video so far has been focused on being ripped off financially, that isn't the only toll that failed early access games has on the player. The emotional toll that early access games take on players is real too. You buy into a game that you're excited about, one that promises to evolve over time, and then it goes offline and disappears like nothing ever happened. It's disappointing, and I have definitely felt saddened by a game I really enjoyed failing to keep its servers running, but I don't know if that says more about the kind of games that I like or about the development teams. PS Prop Night in the Cycle Frontier, I miss you, please come back. Every time a dev posts an update saying, "We're working hard on it, I promise," but then nothing really changes, and then inevitably it's no longer available on the Steam store, you start to feel scammed of something that you were hopeful and optimistic for. And that's sometimes worse than having 30 quid ripped from your caring hands. In some cases, the positive memories have been enough to see us through, and we can recite the famous words of Alfred Tennyson that it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. But when that loss also comes with the financial burden of a modern day video game price tag, maybe it was better just not to have loved. So we've pretty much covered the good, the bad, and the ugly at this point. But to conclude, what is really going to change? Not to be a Debbie Downer, but there is clearly a reason this market is continuing to exist. Although I don't know if it's ever been quite as bad as it is today. We as the consumer kind of have the biggest power though, and that is our wallets, our often too generous wallets. While I'm not going to sit here and tell you not to purchase early access games, because quite frankly, I could never and probably will never follow my own advice where that is concerned. I'm a Twitch streamer, so my life revolves around picking up a game and being done with it in less time than Steam deems reasonable for a full refund. I rarely refund unless the game is actually trash, don't worry. But if you are also sick of the way things are concerning early access games, and I think according to the research I've done, that is a lot of people. Games used to be passionate projects that you could make money from if you did a good job. Now it seems like many are trying their hand at securing the money before deciding to do a good job. If you are going to take the plunge, just ask yourself, are the developers reputable? Do they have a track record of failed attempts, or alternatively really good attempts? But in this, also consider whether you are happy to play a game that is in an unfinished state, or would you rather wait and play a game through just once at its close to full potential, and not far from it with many missing features. I don't think it's always up to the consumer to make sure the games that we're buying are going to be legit though. At some point we have to recognize that the platforms we buy our games on have some kind of duty to protect the consumer as well. This could be by removing games that have been completely abandoned for ages, or allowing refunds on the promises that fell through. I think Steam have made a really good start by letting consumers refund games that they don't like or don't work, but there is really nothing to protect you against games that you chip in for in their early stages to support something you believe in, and that sucks. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt exploited by an early access game? Which games do you think are actually doing it right? Drop a comment down below and let me know. And if you found this video eye-opening or you just really like a good rant, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Until next time, be careful out there when you're backing those early access projects. And hopefully, the more selective we are, the more game development companies will improve the quality of their products. But maybe that's really wishful thinking. Goodbye for now.